Today we're going to take a look at some pistols that were used in the Crimean War. The reason for studying the Crimean War, for me, was to get an idea about the technology that was used in that war and then transferred onto our Civil War here in America. Much of the types of weapons and the technology of such things such as ironclad warships were all first used in the Crimean War. It was the first war in which the entire British Army was equipped with long-range rifled guns, as opposed to the Russian Army, still using pretty much flintlock smoothbores. Things like the telegraph, a railroad connecting the supply bases to the front lines of the British Army. So, as far as guns go, this group here is a good representation of the type of first used firearms in that conflict. Now, revolvers have been used in the war with Mexico, the Colt Walker, the Patterson, in limited amounts. These pistols were used in fairly high volumes during the Crimean War by the British and their allies. We'll go in chronological order. Again, they're all used at the same time, but we'll go with the earliest style to the most advanced style. To start out with, we have the Witten Daw Transitional pistol, and these are called transitional because they go from the earlier pepper box design, as you see in the back of the frame here, to the more advanced Colt cylinder and barrel design. The Witten Daw that we see here has a 6.5-inch barrel. It is about 44 caliber. It has 20 groove rifling, which indicates it was strictly a round ball pistol. On top of the barrel, it reads Witten Daw Company, Improvement, 57 Threadneedle Street. The word improvement is important because these pistols had a system which allowed the cylinder to be locked tightly against the face of the barrel breech to eliminate chain fires. Again, this is an early one. There's some features on it that will be deleted in later guns. To work these pistols, they were first set at half cock, which if you watch the cylinder, you'll actually see it being forced back from the barrel channel. There's a very clever loop spring in the frame here that pushes the cylinder back, allowing it to move freely. There you can see it moving there. Now, once at half cock, these guns were loaded with loose powder from a flask. The paper combustible cartridge, while known, wasn't fully developed or in use yet. So these types of pistols were loaded with loose powder, cylinder by cylinder. The projectile on these was a round ball cast with a tail or spigot on it. A disc of either leather or cardstock or felt, such as this, was then put on that little tail and then peened over, riveted. The reason they did this is because these bullets had to be such that they could be put in by hand. The chambers for the cylinders are actually way oversized of the ball. You can see how loose that would fit in there. So this spacer acted as a tensioner to keep the projectile tight in the cylinder and yet allow you to push it down with thumb pressure. It also acts as a gas check. So once the cylinder is charged with powder, this type of projectile was put in it and manually pushed down with the thumb, and then onto the next cylinder, powder, another projectile pushed down with the thumb. No loading rods on these. Once that was done, primer cones, caps were put on the cones, and the gun was ready to fire. Now, it could be set at rest like so and carried. Generally, half cock was a little safer. The improvement that I mentioned works like this. If you look at the hammer of the gun, you'll see there's a notch here. And if we can get it in the viewfinder, you'll see a square bolt, and this bolt runs between the hammer and the back of the cylinder. Now, if you watch as I drop the hammer, the cylinder will be pushed forward by that bolt and locked into place at this notch here. So as we let the hammer down, you'll see the cylinder goes tight against and is locked in place. What this does is it makes it so it's very difficult to get a chain fire, a tight seal between the cylinder face and the barrel breech. So in operation, these are simply cocked. These are single action guns. They're cocked, fired, cocked, fired, cocked, fired. It's actually a pretty decent gun, well made. The one drawback is the long spur on the hammer does make it a little awkward to cock. If you had to use this in close range quickly, it could be a little bit slow to operate. But otherwise, an excellent gun. These were also used during the India Mutiny. There's a famous painting of British officer wielding a sword, and in his other hand he has a Witten Daw pistol. So these guns had a fair amount of use. One of these was also found in an archaeological find at the only Civil War battle fought in the Arizona Territory. So we know some of these were here during the Civil War as well. So the next advancement in technology for Crimean War weapons is probably the most famous and most sought after, the model 1851 Dean Adams and Dean's trigger action, which is what they call it, we now call it double action, revolving pistol. It is a 5-shot, 4.42 caliber pistol. You'll notice, like the Witten Daw, there is no loading apparatus on it. That's because at this time they were still using the system of charging with loose powder and putting in a projectile with a disc on the end. The one difference between the Witten Daw and the Adams is that the Adams could also fire a conical bullet, but it still had to have the spacer at the back of it to act as a tensioner and a gas check. These guns were mass-produced in swedging dies, but they had to be hand-fit and hand-adjusted, which is partly why they were expensive, and they did not have interchangeable parts. These were made in 3 sizes: the Dragoon model, which is 50 caliber, the belt model, which is what this particular one is, and a pocket model, I believe, was 36 caliber. This was the most popular one because it was the lightest gun for the most firepower. In operation, these did not have a half cock on it. You notice there's no spur on the hammer either. To put this in a situation where you can load it, because there is no half cock, this spring-loaded limb is pushed on with your finger, and then as the gun is brought back slightly, it pushes a bar to lock the hammer out of the way so that the cylinder can now rotate. And it is at this point that you can begin to charge it with powder and put your projectiles in and push them down with your thumb. Again, by the time the 51 Adams was in production, the conical bullet had pretty much taken over from the round ball. But bullet molds for these will have both. The conical bullet worked better. Once the gun was charged with powder and projectiles, it could then be capped with primer caps and was ready to fire. It could be left in this condition where the cylinder is free to spin, or by pulling back on the trigger just a little bit, the mechanism allows this bolt to come out of place and the hammer to come down on the cones or on one of the partitions. Neither is really a safe position. A hit on the back of the hammer, if this was in place over at one of the caps, could discharge it. So it's probably better to carry it like this. In operation, these could be fired only by pulling the trigger. Again, there's no half cock, there's no spur on it to pull the trigger. And that's where some of the problems arrive from. Holding these guns steady by a good double-action shooter, they're quite accurate. But using this in combat, such as at the sandbag batteries during the Crimean War, where one British officer reports being cut off from the rest of his men and rushed by Russian infantry with bayonet, he was able to dispatch 4 of them before the 5th one got him with his bayonet, which tells you about how close you have to be to accurately hit somebody, about bayonet length. And again, the issue is, when you fire these, all your muscle power is used in pulling back the action and allowing the hammer to drop. And in doing so, the gun will oscillate as you try to work the action. So if we can do this where you can see it, they fire like this. And you can see how much that thing is moving. So accuracy, yes, if the gun is held steady and slowly fired. No accuracy except at very close range, again, about bayonet length. But these pistols were well liked because of their rapid fire capability. They're elegant guns. Of all the weapons, revolvers during the war, this is probably the most elegant gun. Again, expensive to make, but well liked. These two were used in the India Mutiny. There they ran into problems with them, partially because of the damp, hot weather. They had problems with them not firing, probably ruined the caps. These are also very popular in the American Civil War by both the North and South, primarily the South. So, again, Dean Adams, and these are rifled. The next gun is the model 1851 Colt Navy, so called because of the warship scene on the cylinder. It's a scene done by Ormsby on a roller engraver between the Republic of Texas and the Mexican Navy during the Texas War of Independence. It kind of commemorates that. The Colt Navy has a 7.5-inch barrel, 36 caliber. The cylinder has a capability of 6 shots. Also, one advantage the Colt has over the other guns, it's a simpler gun. It only has 4 moving parts. It has a locking bolt that keeps the cylinder tightly locked against the breech with no drift. The Witten Daw and the Adams do not have this feature, and the cylinders on these two can drift a little bit if they're not handled right, which would shave lead off the bullet when it's fired. A thing about Colt, as soon as he got his patent, he immediately went to Harper's Ferry and had John Hall instruct him on what technology was needed to make interchangeable parts, the tooling, the machines, the gauging work, and Colt did that almost immediately. And because of that, his pistols had interchangeable parts, which made them more serviceable in the field. Now, about 1852, the British ordered about 2,000 Colt Navies to issue to their Navy. And that's why we see the earliest Model 51s having brass frames. Colt only had ready to ship brass frame parts. They were shipped to London and assembled and proofed there. If we look at a Colt Navy pistol, we will see a London-made one. We will see the top of the frame is marked, address, Colonel Colt, London. Each cylinder will have a proof mark showing V for viewed or GP for gunmaker's proof, and they alternate from cylinder to cylinder. Also, on the frame of the London-made Navies, we'll find the same marks, the GP and the V, along with the DW for War Department and the broad arrow. So this would have been a military or Navy issued one, but a lot of these saw use in the Crimean War, and they were well liked because of their reliability and their ease to keep them working. The Colt Navy can be fired relatively quickly, not as fast as the Dean Adams, but it has the advantage of being able to be aimed and can fire longer ranges. I found that the Colt Navy is probably the most user-friendly, well, almost, but the most accurate of all these guns. Again, too, the Colt Navies were used in the Indian Mutiny. There's an incident where one British officer reported shooting an attacker with a smaller caliber Dean Adams pistol and having no effect, and after he survived the attack, he wrote he was going to get a Colt pistol as soon as he could possibly get one, which tells you something about how much they were liked. Also, of course, in the Civil War, both sides used Colt Navies, but of American manufacture. Next gun of interest in our technology here is the French Lefaucheux pistol. This is the 12mm Navy version. What's unique about the Lefaucheux, it is the first handgun, see combat, that used a fully contained metallic cartridge. Big advantage over all the loose powder and cap type weapons. These cartridges were made by taking a brass disc and running it through a series of dies to form the cartridge. It has a little pocket on the inside which holds a fulminate material. There is a firing pin that rests just above the fulminate, so when it's struck it fires the entire cartridge. The downsides to these is that there was a limit to how much powder you can put in this, how big you can make it, because of the drawn cartridge. If it was overpowered, it would start to tear the cartridge. The Lefaucheux, this particular one is a Model 54. It was used in the Crimean War, but I haven't found any personal references to how well they worked or any issues with them, so we don't have much to work on. There may be some references, I just haven't seen them yet. Also, in appearance, the Lefaucheux is very similar to the Colt. They're both open-top frames. They both have about 4 moving parts to operate them. They're both single action. The left show has a few more screws holding its frame assembly together. It's a bit more complicated than the Colt. In operation, it is put at half cock, the loading gates opened, and cartridges can then simply be put in. You can see how the firing pin sticks up through the slot here, closed. Now this is a live cartridge, so we're not going to fool around with it too much. But all the cylinders will be loaded the same way. Once it's closed, the gun can be brought to full cock, and of course the firing pins would be sticking out above the cylinder here, and the hammer would strike them. And of course you repeat the action. Once fired, the loading gate can be opened, and the empty cartridges have to be put at half cock first. Empty cartridges can be pushed out very quickly, much like a Model 73 Colt, almost the same thing. So you can see the advantages in combat, where a pistol like this would be much quicker to use than any of these. Plus you eliminate having to deal with loose powder or unreliable combustible cartridges, caps that don't stick or fall off. This eliminates all that, but it's a little underpowered. Now, we don't see any references of the left to show in the Indian Mutiny, but certainly in the Civil War, the federal forces bought about 2,000 of these at the beginning of the war. Certainly some of the southern units were able to get these, but they were very popular, even though they were a bit underpowered. So, as you can see, the Crimean War introduced this type of firepower into the battlefield. And again, repeated in our Civil War with some advances. The English pistols, by the time of our American Civil War, were fit with loading at rods and made it much easier to load them with that, like the Colt. So having seen these, we will next, in our next post, we will take a look at what the Russians were using during the Crimean War. And that will be our next post coming up. For additional information, I highly recommend this particular book. It deals mostly with uniforms and souvenirs, but it does give a fair amount of information, or at least pictorial information, on weapons in the Crimean War. And here you can see very good photograph work, a Colt Navy, and a more advanced version of our Witten Daw with a loading rod and a port ahead of the cylinder to relieve any pressure from a chain fire, which this early one does not have. So I highly recommend this book as a reference. It deals with every type of firearm commonly used in the Crimean War. So with that, we'll close this post, and the next one will deal with the Russian weapons.